What a game. What an occasion. This weekend, France and New Zealand played out an incredible 30 points to 29 thriller at the Stade de France. One of the most memorable matches of the year. And so what you're seeing right now isn't that, but the game they played 3 years ago, because Sky New Zealand have started geo-blocking our videos and taking stuff down. Yet, with a game like this, we simply had to dig in and instead deliver our analysis orally through a conversation with the odd little still a la the World Cup, looking at this game and starting with the incredible record that France now hold. So, this was France's third win in a row over the All Blacks. The second time they've ever done this, the previous one being in the 90s. 4, if they win again next time they play, would be a record. I think this has become the game they want to win most, is the All Blacks. It's the game they kind of set as their bar of how well they're doing, you know, more than South Africa, who might be the best team in the world at the minute. But France very much set themselves as like, no, we judge ourselves against how we do against the All Blacks.
It's the coolest thing though, isn't it? If you can say, oh, we've got a dominant streak over the literal, like the famous world mighty All Blacks. Like, yeah, why wouldn't you target that one? And again, like being relatively similar teams, not like identical, but relatively similar teams. I think there is something of like, we want to stop our authority as being like the attacking team.
And yet, what we saw this week was France really dominate through their defence. Like, their defence was the talking point of this game.
For me, like, I think one of my favourite parts of that game was that defensive set just before half-time.
Yes.
Where, you know, it was just the All Blacks had just got them under the cosh, looked to really like piling the pressure on them, and France just sit through a load of phases, let the All Blacks come at them a little bit, and there's a few massive shots that are made. You know, Jean-Baptiste Gros makes a huge one, Thibaut Flamand makes a huge one. Mo Vaca constantly is like in the thick of it. He had a brilliant game. There was one really good moment where he kind of won them a penalty by rolling away into the path of Ardi Sarvier, causing him to trip over, and the referee goes, "Oh, Sarvier's come off his feet."
Straight off his feet, penalty given.
And like Mo Vaca is, for me, like one of those players who really sums up this effort that France are putting in D. Between him and Gaël Fickou.
Gaël Fickou is in the category of Mario Toge and to an extent Sia Khaleesi. There's a few players in this category, Tulibi Falatau is another one, who every single time I watch them play live, I go, yeah, they had a pretty good game. You know, you kind of give them like a 7 as a player rating. Then you watch the game back and you're like, oh, they were the best player on the pitch.
Yeah.
And Fickou, I thought, watching it back a second time, was the best player on the pitch. Though Malvaca and Bill Barre have a real claim for that. Roygaard was fantastic and one of the best games of his career so far.
So good.
Ardi Sarve is always ridiculous, you know. But again, the thing that really stands out is that togetherness of the French defence, but also how the All Blacks were able to attack them, you know?
Yeah.
And so you talk about that passage just before half-time. So much of what France were doing right in defence comes from stemming the All Black momentum early, right? We saw the All Blacks make an awful lot of ground, an awful lot of yardage through doing, it's a classic thing, right? For Sean Edwards' defence, it's something people used to run against Wales all the time, is that because the defence is led by 13, those kind of outwards channels, rather than the kind of South African system where they have the second guy out from the ruck blitzes up. Instead, it's because it's coming from wider end, they want to force you back in towards the ruck, rather than forcing you out to the touchline. What we saw the All Blacks do incredibly well was just get on the outside of that guy, you know? And so they were regularly setting these forward pods that were kind of joined together initially, that would then space out slightly, you know? So they were still in position to clear out from each other. But it meant that if you had one guy, usually, you know, a Fickou, or occasionally you get a forward in that position, you know, you'd have someone like Roma filling in there. They would fly out a line, trying to make this big read on one of these free carriers, smash them, and instead the ball could just go beyond them and they could get like on the outside of that channel, you know, where they're softest. France just outside that 13 channel. And we saw them do that superbly a few times. You know, the lead up to the opening try scored by Larky, that is how they get through, you know? And then they do it working back, again, the same way, throwing that massive ball over the top. Villiers goes for the intercept, which if he'd got it, he's in. Like, that's a ball worth going for. Instead, it lands in the arms of Ardi Sarve, who I think you said to me during the game, like, is he the greatest edge forward of all time?
I think he is, yeah. You know, in terms of like a 1v1 carry, if you get him in that, he will literally win it every single time, you know?
Yeah, and so Sarve is able to storm down the flank, you know, they reset, they play a few phases, and it eventually ends up back in his hand. The All Blacks having, again, gone straight into that 13 channel, you know, having Scott Barrett carry there. Eventually gets back down the side, and they manage to work it back the other way, having now contorted this back around, and get through, and, you know, Ardi Sarve bursts through about 16 billion tackles. I think the entire population of France go for his ankles, and he just drops them, until eventually someone gets him to ground, and he offloads, and Lakai scores his first All Black try.
Every time New Zealand tried to attack kind of on the outside channel, like if they had forwards there, they'll try and tip it on every single time.
Yeah.
You know, and if not, if it's kind of in that scenario where you're kind of between the pod and the edge forward kind of situation, they will always try and play it out the back and just get it as wide as they physically could. And I think once France figured that out and adapted to that, that was where they really started to cook in defence. You know, there's the lead up to Louis Bielbiaré's try, which again for me is the other kind of like defensive highlight of the game. If you look at the way Gaio Fickou kind of contorts his body, he doesn't overcommit to either of the options there, the tip on or the guy out the back. And he almost acts like a goalkeeper. You know how like goalkeepers are coached to just like make their body as big as possible, make themselves really difficult to read. And Fickou just kind of does that, and he doesn't physically make a tackle. He doesn't physically make contact with, I think it's Tupou Vai who drops the ball in the end. And yet, just by being there, being so present, and being a physical threat to both options there, he forces the knock on, which leads to Rameau kicking it downfield for Bielbiaré, who skins Severis to score the try.
Yeah, and I thought Bielbiaré was superb, you know. Obviously, the tries, there's another one where Dupont does a perfect cross kick for him, which he, you know, Will Jordan just about gets a touch on, otherwise that would have been another try.
That's Bielbiaré's specialty, is moments like that.
Those moments are the things that stand out, right? But you watch this game back, there are 2 or 3 moments where he competes at the breakdown and makes a real difference in slowing people in or even just bringing extra bodies in. You know, there's one turnover where he would have won the turnover, but there's a neck roll on him which still gives France the penalty. Like, I thought it was that he's added to his game, you know,
100%.
in the last year. He is a completely different player to at the World Cup last year, you know? And it was something that Gabon Villiers, having a sevens background, always brought to the game. And I think that's a huge boon for France because they love their backs going for jackals.
Yeah, and it's similar to like what the Springboks do, you know, with Colby and Aaron Sirs, kind of the 2 short kings on the wing who are going for jackals all the time, really physical. And Louis Bielbiaré kind of leapfrogged Villiers into the team during the last World Cup for his flair, his try scoring. Again, that chip in behind that he's so good at and just scores loads of tries off, right? But I think that's what he's added to the game, you know. Like this time last year, we were looking at their loss to the Springboks by a point and they constantly bombarded his wing. You know, they sent Damien Dialande, they sent Peter Steph Toye and Ebedetsebet down his wing after him.
And cross kick after cross kick.
That's it, because they'll compete in the air, they'll compete on the floor, and they would completely out-muscle him in all of these facets of the game. Whereas I think Bielbiaré's really taken that to heart and just gone, I need to work on this. And he has. Like, he dominated in those areas on Saturday. And for me, like at the time, watching it live, I would have thought he was the man of the match for sure.
And I think that kicking game is another interesting area, right? Because the All Blacks didn't find any weaknesses in France from behind, you know, aerially, be it, you know, just finding ground. France kicked the ball far more, and I think ultimately, you know, I know it was ultimately a 1-point difference, but you look at those final stages of that game, right? The All Blacks don't feel like they're going to go anywhere because they're trapped in their own territory. And so much of the match ended up like that, you know? They were reliant on penalties and little moments or little individual errors or Thomas Ramos being Thomas Ramos in order for them to get downfield. And again, a lot because of that defence. But we saw the All Blacks broadly only kicking when things weren't going well, you know, and there was a few kicks that were pure moments of frustration. And what we got instead was France being much more tactical and smart in how they kicked. And I think that's an interesting thing because this Scott Robertson All Blacks team is starting to develop a real identity in the way they kick. And it's something I do like about them, you know, is that they only kick under certain situations and they've got a clear game plan and idea. And we saw France, I think, figure that out a little bit and pin them back.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the one I was on about earlier with the one on half-time, where they go for the drop goal, which is a different kind of kick to the one you're on about. But let's say that they're 50 metres further back there, right? They would have kicked a lot earlier. And it's one of those where as a defence you take it as a compliment, that they've kicked inside 2-3 metres because they know they're going to go back. And instead, they try and knock on the door. It's on the verge of half-time. Then eventually they just go, right, let's just go for a high-risk, low-reward, you know, 3-point opportunity, and they miss, you know?
However, I do have one take I want to offer about France's defence, right? And I don't think France defensively are getting the most out of Antoine Dupont.
Okay, interesting.
Now, the way Dupont defends for France is very much part of that Sean Edwards system, right? It's the way that Mike Phillips and Gareth Davis and Thomas Williams and Lloyd Williams and Ali Davis and so many great scrum halves, you know, all-timers like Rodri Williams have all defended in the past, you know. And then, you know, you go back to his Wasps team, they defend in the same way. They have the scrum half in the main line, high, often filling on the wings, you know, as a kind of auxiliary winger, and then shooting out a line, you know, to make big reads, normally inspired by the fact that the scrum half they normally have in would be brave, but not like
Not
the
physically
biggest
dominant,
yeah. But even if Mike Phillips was, that added an extra layer to it, And so what they're doing with Dupont is that they're having him wait in line, and occasionally, he's normally on the two wings, but occasionally he shoots out and he tries to make a big tackle or a big read. And Toulouse, on the other hand, have him operate in a much more traditional scrum half role, where he floats behind the play as a sweeper and then occasionally comes into the main line and shoots in to make a big read in the same way.
Plugging gaps a little bit, yeah.
But the thing that allows Dupont to do with Toulouse that he isn't doing with France is jackal.
Yeah.
And we saw Dupont go for one jackal over the weekend, and that was it.
Yeah.
And that's become one of the biggest strengths of his game over the last year.
Yeah.
And France aren't using him to the full of his ability. You can still have him coming out of line and shooting in, but instead he's part of a system, when actually I think with their attack, they contort so much of it to be about how do we get this guy into situations where he can be a freak. And defensively, they're not doing that, when actually I think over the last year, Antoine Dupont's defence has become maybe his biggest asset.
If you think about the best jackler potentially of all time, David Pocock, okay? Yeah. One thing that he was really good at was lingering as the kind of tackle assist on tackles where we thought a turnover would be possible, right? But David Pocock was a 7 or 8, right? Antoine Dupont, the beauty of him is he's a 9, right? As you say, he goes in that sweeper role typically for Toulouse. Typically, people think that's to cover chips. That is usually what it's there for, and kind of the room in behind. If someone misses a tackle, there's a half break, whatever, he can finish it off. But you're right, for this, it can just be when I sense a turnover, I get in there. As you say, it happened 4 or 5 times in the Champions Cup final, the highest level of club rugby he's possibly played at.
It's one of these things, right? Sean Edwards has his set system. As long as he's there, they're not changing it for one player, no matter what a talent he is. But I just think it's a thing that France could be doing to potentially get more out of him.
But the thing is, every team changes how they defend based on Dupont.
Exactly. And so this comes into the other thing, right, that I think is relevant to Dupont. I have never, in my life, seen an All Black team go so hard on trying to cancel out and target one opposition player as he did Dupont on Saturday.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable, the emphasis the All Blacks had clearly put on this one guy, And so you compare how they defended this weekend to how they defend normally. They defended so much closer to the ruck. They normally had 2 men around the ruck. They were bringing Cam Roygaard, who normally, as it operates either in the sweeper role or, often fills on the wing, as most teams use their scrum half to do. They had him constantly around the breakdown, but not behind, on the fringe, so he could get in and get an arm to Dupont, so he had someone quicker to get in there.
And he did a great job of it, by the way, sniping at Dupont. A lot of people have made kind of the observation that Roygaard, kind of as an individual, right, had a better game than Dupont on the weekend. And I don't disagree with that. I think individually, that is true. He took his try superbly, tackling Aldrit, taking the interception whilst marking Dupont. That's an incredible piece of skill. His kicking game is fantastic. I'm loving Roygaard at the moment. And what's really interesting is, that's true. Roygaard individually, sure. And yet, what Dupont did to help his team win the game was even more significant
greater
for
than
it.
Roygaard's contribution, I think. Yeah.
As I say,
that's the thing.
It was better for that, for the fact that he knew he was being targeted, so he just started playing as a scrum half, and passing the ball a little bit more. And the little passes back inside, which all scrum halves try, and they very rarely work. And yet, because there's somebody who operates essentially as an extra forward, as a pick and go merchant, you can do that because you attract so many eyes.
He was able to open an enormous gap for Colomb to go through. Do you know how big a gap has to be for Colomb?
It has to be the size of Croatia.
And then some, because Colomb himself is almost as big as Croatia. It's that is the thing about Dupont, as I think he adapted this game perfectly to the conditions he was playing in, because he was so heavily targeted. Yeah. You had both, as I say, Roygaard and Cody Taylor very regularly going for him, very regularly just cheekily getting an arm on his leg, or, there's a move France tried to run here first phase, but I think if they ran it with any other player, they probably create a break here. But Taylor just goes, no, I'm watching Dupont, and drops his shoulder on Dupont, so he isn't in line to run his line, to go straight through.
Yeah.
And there's so many of those moments throughout the entire game of players just holding Dupont. There's a break that is eventually made by Miafu that comes from Sarvea holding Dupont way after him giving the ball and not filling back into line when he easily could have. If it's any other scrum half, he fills back in, that break isn't made. But instead, he's like, oh God, no, this guy is the danger. We don't want him running a support line. We don't want him getting ahead. And he opens up a gap accidentally.
The funny thing is, I look at this game and I go, this as a massive France victory, this one wasn't about Dupont. Because New Zealand targeted him. They went after him so much, right? And so they cancelled out so much of his game. Danny Kerr was talking on 5 Live once before and just saying, like, I cannot remind you enough that every single opposition that come up against him have him on their team room, like a photo of him in their team room during the week, and they're going, how do we stop him doing something? And he still does stuff, you know? And on this occasion, it's kind of the opposite of that. That he then took that as an opportunity to go, right, everyone's watching me. Let's see Mo Vaca shine. Let's let Miafu run 50 metres downfield because no one can tackle him because he's massive, you know?
The other thing to note on Dupont's performance as well is that he spent most of the week in bed with gastroenteritis. You know, as did Colom, who came on and despite being the size of Croatia, struggled in the scrum. It kind of makes sense when you realise he spent all week in bed with the shits. Like, yeah, of course, okay, that makes more sense why the biggest man alive suddenly struggled. But Roy God was absolutely superb and added the kind of tempo to the All Blacks game because in attack, they had patterns they knew would work and they stuck to them, you know? And I thought Barrett was quietly very good in that way that, like, it's almost become a bloody squidge. First gives all the credit to Dupont for a game where he was quiet. Then to bloody Bowden Barrett again. Bloody squidge. What next? Going to credit Adam Beard for this. But the thing is, yeah, I think this All Black performance was mature and sensible. And one of the big talking points of the game was with, 6 minutes to go, them deciding to kick a penalty from 40-odd metres to get them within 1 point rather than go for the corner to try and go for the try that would win it. And I think that is kind of a reflection of who Scott Robertson's All Blacks are, because I think they are a very mature, grown-up team who think things through and go, no, we'll be sensible rather than emotional, you know, and yet play with that kind of togetherness and edge. And they almost... My growing feeling about this All Blacks team is that they, and I mean this as a compliment, almost feel like a club team. They feel like you have a group of players and they're guys who are together day in, day out, and they love each other and they play for each other.
That's nice.
And they're kind of really fired up to perform for each other rather than being a big superstar team, you know? And that has grown over this autumn in a way I don't think it was necessarily there over the summer. They still felt like the All Blacks, here they are, they're a brand, look at this, it's like the Harlem Globetrotters, the Barbarians or something. And I think instead, they've started to grow this real sense of identity over the last few weeks, and this was another game for that, even though they came up short for the first time this tour.
So with that, instead of me asking you where you think this leaves the All Blacks, do you think this will impact the All Blacks? Do you think it will leave a dent on them at all? Or do you think they'll just look at it and just go like, look, it's a 1 point loss against a world-class team. I know that any time the All Blacks lose, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
But in the context of that, what do you reckon?
They play Italy this weekend, right? I don't think it's going to impact that game.
And they've gone full beans for it.
Yeah. They've picked pretty much their strongest team. Italy've also picked pretty much their strongest team, though, so it should be an even contest. I think the only way in which this matters is when they play France again. Because at this point, and this is an incredible thing to think, there are All Black players out there who will be at 20, 30 caps into their career, possibly even more, without ever beating France. You know? Like, you've got to go back to, 2018 for the last time the All Blacks beat France?
So true.
Which is astonishing. And so there will be players who've got really solid international careers, been playing Test rugby for 5 years, without ever beating them. And as Wales fans who grew up watching them play Australia knows, bogey teams matter. Like, they stick with you, you know, and that contributes massively. So going into a World Cup, if New Zealand and France get drawn together again, or if they end up playing down the road in the knockouts, then I think it matters.
Yeah.
As far as their growth as a team, I don't think it does, you know? I kind of think they'll continue as though exactly the same as if they'd won this game.
How about France then?
Yeah.
So do you see this as this is a huge stepping stone for them, or is it significant that this is seen as kind of business as usual for France?
Yeah, I think this is the game that France measure themselves against, right? Like, they measure themselves as how we're doing against the All Blacks. And next they head into Six Nations, which that is the other tournament they measure themselves on, right? Is, did we win the Six Nations? Did we perform? Under Galtier, incredibly, even though they've become this world-beating team, they've only won the Six Nations once.
Yeah.
Next year, I think, with Ireland looking slightly more off-song than they had the last few years, their target is very much going to be to get that second title, you know? And I think they probably now go in as favourites, and this will help enormously. If they'd fallen over and they'd not performed in this game, then I think it has a big impact.
Yeah.
If they'd lost it to a last-minute kick, I think it's emotionally like a massive kick in the teeth going into the Argentina game, which then, you know, if they lose 2 games in a row, if they lose that, who knows? But I think it is really crucial for France to rebuild some of that confidence after the Six Nations that was slightly ropey. Other thing I'd say about the Six Nations as well is that they will have Damien Penaud was out with flu. You know, I hope he gets well soon. It's apparently a lung issue, which meant he was really short of breath just walking. Never mind, you know, running down the wing, beating All Blacks and scoring interception tries as he hasn't passed. But also Roman Untermack come back in. And I don't think you can target Dupont in the same way if Untermack's there. You know, I think he's so sharp at looking for that and just stretching on the outside of people and watching where defence congests. So that's going to be interesting if Untermack is back in time for the Six Nations.
You add that as well, like Cyril Bay and Willie Antonio, both not there. You know, Paul Valemsa potentially has come back into the fold. You know, there's so many players that you look at and potentially could come back in. And what's fascinating about that last game is both teams could potentially look at aspects of that and view it as an off day. Both of them can potentially go up another gear, which to say how insanely good they both were and how high intensity the game was says a lot about that as a fixture.
Absolutely. I'll say it again. What a game, what a match, and most of all, what a fixture. I am absolutely buzzing for the next time these two teams play, which I guess will be next summer when the second team will be available. But that's fine. All we need is to lose to not do very well in the top 14 this season, which should be fine because I hear they're shit. And therefore, Dupont and Untermack and Co can all travel over to New Zealand.
I thought they were deliberately not doing it because they were scared. Oh, never mind.
No. I heard that as well. But actually, it's entirely a scheduling conflict, which they made because they were scared.
They're scared of Cheslin Colby.
Yeah, they're scared of schedule. They're scared of scheduling. Like Dupont is just terrified of calendars. No one knows this. That's why he's never played against Alex and the Welsh women's team. Do you have anything else to add before we wrap this up?
Allez les Bleus, allez Alex Calendar.
Psst, if you want more of this, right, we did one on Ireland v Argentina. That's on our second channel. We've also got a roundup of all the games, everything right down to UAE v Germany. Go and have a look. We'll see you very soon for more rugby.